What are the best examples of FU money you've seen? Guy I used to work for thought it would be funny to hire a limo to take a friend to lunch. The restaurant was literally next door to where they were. Limo company refused to rent by the hour and said he had to hire it for the entire day. He was angry, so just bought a limo. After lunch he was still angry and decided to just buy a few more and start his own limo company. Month or two later, he bought the company that refused him an hourly rental. Growing up, our neighbor was incredibly wealthy, probably in the low nine figures, owned a tremendous amount of land, and could probably influence the price of beef with the amount of cattle he had, and oil, of course. He was in his 80s, health was deteriorating, so his kids showed up while he was recovering from surgery and explained to him they didn't want him driving anymore and took his truck. Soon as they left, he called a local dealership and had a brand new truck dropped off an hour later. Kids came back over the next day, and he just told them he decided he wanted to keep driving and was fine buying another new truck every day if he had to. I knew a guy who owned a machine factory next to an industrial complex I managed. I met him when I was on site at about 6 a.m., and he was walking through the gates. He was dressed like a homeless man and told me he used to use our gates as a shortcut to get to his factory. He would wander through and then slip through a hole in the fence to access his factory because he couldn't be bothered walking around. Anyway, got talking, and it turned out he lived in the area, which at this time was a pretty rough area, full of industrial land and some rough residential areas, because his family used to own all the land around when it was farmland and had gradually sold it off, but he stayed in the family home. He was a very wealthy man. He was mad as a cut snake, but pretty canny and seriously rich. He told me the story that he had neighbors who had moved in and were parking their cars on his driveway. He asked them to stop. They didn't. He knew they were renting. So he bought the house and evicted them. Here in the States, I was at a FedEx store, and the family ahead of me had a rather large box. Like a solid 36 by 36 by 36, I heard them say with a British accent the address it was to be sent to in the UK. Seems normal so far, right? Cashier asked when he wanted it to arrive. Note, this was at about noon. He said tomorrow with a straight face. The cashier sort of laughed and said something like, sir, that's gonna be about $1,000 to $100. Customer simply said, that's fine, and handed over his black Amex. My jaw hit the floor. My dad used to do handyman work for a fairly rich guy. He had a house in the hills with quite a few acres. Someone bought one of the hills next to him and started building a house. He didn't like how it looked, so he bought it from them and halted construction and had all traces of construction removed. Then, he didn't like how much land was surrounding him, with no fence. His property line was now too far to see. So he just had a fence put in, across the middle of his land, so he could see a fence. About 20 years ago, I worked the flight line at AFBO basically, a place at the airport where private planes park and get service, etc. I worked at a more upscale FBO, so we mostly handled Citations, Gulfstreams, and the like private jets. One day, a customer, who was repeatedly described to me as the Prince of Saudi Arabia, came in on his personal DC-10. This thing was huge and complicated compared to most of our customers, in part because it was a special head of a state with fuck you money tricked out DC-10. Among other things visible from the exterior was a full suite of military countermeasures, missile jammers, chaff/flares, and several others I couldn't identify. He was only scheduled to be there a few days. On his planned departure date, he rolls up with an entourage in Bentleys, steps out, then before boarding says, I want to go shopping. The entourage packs up and fucks off, just like that. Days go by, then a week, then two. Management raises their daily cost for parking considerably, charging thousands a day, but the prince doesn't care. Day in and day out, we stare at this billionaire's plane sitting there, telling each other our theories about what was inside. A month goes by. Then one day, all hands on deck, the prince wants to leave. Tonight, we have to prep ADC-10 with full amenities in just a few hours. We were scrambling, getting her fueled up, running through checks, servicing the shitters, etc. When the catering folks needed a hand, we all volunteered to help so we could get a look at the inside of the plane. I enter, and on my left is the cockpit. Behind the cockpit is an armored security room that looks like something from Crimson Tide. A bunch of screens with radar, cameras, controls for all the fancy military toys, etc. I turn right, and the walkway is a narrow corridor which walks past the prince's private room. Behind the private room was a lounge with a coffee bar, couches, lots of artwork, and gold trim. Further back was a more traditional airline cabin with business class-sized seats for about 30 to 40 staffers. I'll never forget what I saw when I looked into the prince's private room. It was like something out of a Judd Apatow movie, like it was a parody of itself. In the center was a king-size bed covered with satin sheets and a tiger fur blanket. The ceiling above the bed was, I shit you not, a mirror. The room was dimly lit in warm red and orange tones with opulent plush furniture and expensive-looking decorations. To cap it all off was a portrait of the prince in a military uniform hanging directly over the bed. My boss is ultra-wealthy, dude lives up the hill from Dr. Dre, and was neighbors with Tom Brady, among other people. One of his neighbors is T-Pain. Story was shared that T-Pain moved into the house and didn't like the facade, so he was paying to have it removed and changed to something else. Common for mansions where you want to change the appearance without replacing the whole thing. Anyway, the workers spend quite some time removing the facade when T-Pain decides that no, he did actually kind of like it. So he paid them to rebuild it exactly as it had been. My parents died in a car accident when I was 13, and I landed with a Mormon foster family. They made me do all the Mormon things when I was living with them. I never believed in the church, but I went along with it because I didn't have a choice. My biological parents were pretty well off, and they left me with a significant trust fund managed by a non-Mormon lawyer who was a friend of theirs. The rule was that, when I was underage, the fund could only be used for education and health expenses. Then once I graduated high school, I would take full ownership of the money at my next birthday. All during my time with the Fosters, they tried to gaslight me into the idea that once I got rights to the money, I would sign it over to them in gratitude for the work they'd done in raising me. Senior year came, and they started anticipating what they'd do with the money when they got it. They took out a couple of loans, one for home remodeling, another for a fancy car, all to show off status in the church when they hosted my graduation party in May. But I had other plans. Graduation happened, and then soon after I went in to the lawyer to confirm that I didn't have to sign over the money after all. I was entitled to do whatever I wanted with it. Then my birthday came in July, when we went over to the lawyer's office for signing. He had foresight enough to hire an off-duty police officer to defuse the situation when I told them they were getting nothing. They were escorted out of the office, and I finished up the paperwork without them. The off-duty officer also gave me an escort back to their house, so I could pack up my stuff and leave to a safe house. I quit the church, with no contact with the foster family, and haven't looked back. I heard rumors they went bankrupt since they weren't able to pay back the loans they took out. I had a teacher in high school who taught carpentry and a media or photography class. He was genuinely the best teacher I ever had. He was kind, caring, funny, and was only a teacher because he enjoyed it. It was well known throughout the school that he was loaded. He owned a bunch of restaurants, several big medical officer buildings, and, as he put it, dabbled in stocks. I don't know how much money he really had, but he was definitely a little petty with it. His neighbor's dog was constantly shitting in his yard, and after months of nothing being done about it, he went to the guy's bank and bought out his mortgage. The neighbor had to start making his mortgage payment to my teacher, and surprise, surprise, no more dog shit. Around 12 years ago, my younger brother had some legal troubles and a substance issue, and my family was poor by every definition of the word. We have some very wealthy relatives, and my mom's cousin wrote my mother a check to help pay for legal fees and a rehab facility. The bank told my mother the check was so large it would take between 10 to 14 days to clear and be posted to the account. My mom is hysterical and in tears because if you've ever been poor, when you need money, you need it yesterday. My aunt came down there and tried to get it cleared, and it didn't help. She called her husband and told him the deal and that my mom was her family and she needed to help her family now. Within 5 minutes, the bank manager came out with an updated balance sheet showing the check has been posted and cleared and could be used immediately. Apparently, my uncle called and said every person associated with him would be transferring or closing their accounts by the week's end. Just him and his wife's accounts were worth millions of dollars, and that excluded his children. Late 90s, I started college. College cross-country team went to the all-you-can-eat pancake place. Cost of the meal was $2.50 including tax. One of the third-year guy had the team record at 23 pancakes and talked the feed up our entire training camp. One of the incoming freshmen said he could beat that. The freshman said $20 says I can beat it. The other guy responded with if you beat it, I will give you $1 for every pancake you eat. Freshman guy puts away 30 to pancakes. Third-year guy begrudgingly pays up and freshman leaves the full amount as his earnings as a tip. It was a $32 tip on a 2.50-cent bill. We normally just paid the price of a normal meal $5 to $6 because the servers were getting screwed on tips when they ran this special. The look of anger on the third-year guy's face when his money was left on the table was equally matched by the sheer joy the lady's face. Basically told us the worker for below minimum wage on that day because everyone just left a 50-cent tip and they had to work 4 times harder running food all night.